Welcome to Coaching Uncaged by Animas, the podcast that explores the art, science, and career of coaching. And now, introducing your host and interviewer, Yannick Jacob.
Julia Menaul, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for inviting me, Yannick.
It is my pleasure, especially today, because your most recent publication was around coaching with bereavement. And, well, you're talking to an existential coach. So existentialists by reputation love talking about death and endings. Mm-hmm. I think that also means that, this can be a heavy subject, especially if people have lost someone. So I just wanted to, I'm not usually a fan of trigger warnings because, it's, I think, difficult to speak if we were to pay attention to all of that. Mm-hmm. But I think when it comes to death and dying, it is a heavy topic, and it might sit, especially when this is a fresh experience for people. It might be difficult to listen to some of this. So today, I just wanted to put that out there.
No, that's fine. I agree, because sometimes it can be unexpected for people as well, and they didn't expect to be triggered by something. So yeah, that's fine.
Well, I guess long-term listeners of the podcast know that for me, that's probably more to be expected than not to be expected, because endings are everywhere and time is everywhere. Well, talking about time, I'm not sure if that's a great transition, but I've just been thinking you've been coaching for over I think it's been 23 years. I read that your first coaching training,
very accurate, yes,
was in 2000. You qualified as an executive coach. You have a previous career in management. You have like a long trained managers, and then you moved into coaching. So what was it, about 10 years into your training career? So you've always worked kind of in development and developing people, and then coaching really took you. So then moved into coaching supervision, and along that path, you've written quite a lot. You've got a couple of books out, most notably, obviously, the one we just mentioned, Coaching and Supervision Through Bereavement, with your colleague, Uza Zhao.
Zhao, yeah.
Yes, excellent. And you've written around running a successful executive coaching business. You've written a few bits, 2 chapters in 101 coaching supervision techniques, particularly fond of the drama triangle, as I take it. So there's a long history in the corporate world. I know you know Peter Hawkins, you did some supervision for Bath Consultancy. So there's a lot of corporate coaching work. So I guess what I wanted to open with is, how does one move from, maybe not really a move, but what was the story behind having quite a corporately grounded organizational coaching career, and then grief and loss and bereavement? Compassion, there's a lot in there. So I'd love to feel into that a little bit to start us off.
Yeah, what a great question. I think it's part of life's journey as you mature and you get older. I'm 61 now, so there's that the things that happen to you in your life. You do start to experience different things and then become interested in different things. So you mentioned the compassion, and I'd sort of forgotten about that, but that was part of being in a project with somebody who's doing a dissertation for mindfulness for coaches. So that started that, and it was a gradual movement, I think, as things change in life. I think supervision as well creates more of a psychological depth to your work. And my first degree when I was in my 20s was psychology, so it was always there, and wanting to move away from the more corporate to something that felt more real. But the bereavement came about by accident, like most of these things often do. And that was something. My father died in June 2018 after a long illness, and one of the things that I was fascinated by, and I talk about this in the book, is how people respond. So it was my first sort of major family death, really, and their expectations of how you are meant to be during that period. And I guess for some people, I wasn't responding in the way they would expect for somebody who's just lost their father.
How did you respond?
Yeah, well, for them, I didn't seem very upset. You know, a best friend was puzzled that I didn't seem to be reacting at all.
Yeah, they can get really concerned. It's like, oh, she's in denial.
Yes.
You know, she's not processing this.
Yes, it's all going to come out later. And making assumptions about what your relationship is like with that parent, possibly based on what their relationship is like with their parent. And so they're thinking, well, this is how I would feel if my father died. So ergo, you should be feeling like that too.
Oh, yeah, my story is supposed to be your story.
Yeah. So I was quite fascinated by that, because it was people ostensibly who knew me really well. So it just got me thinking about bereavement, grief and loss. Anyway, I just put a posting on LinkedIn and just started this discussion about it. And it morphed into a bigger conversation about, does bereavement, grief and loss show up in the coaching room? And should we be doing anything with it as coaches? Or is it very much the remit of counselling? As we know in the coaching world, brilliant coaches all coming up with some fantastic things. The thread in LinkedIn was just fantastic. And it stimulated the thought that actually there isn't really anything out there about bereavement, grief and loss in coaching. Nobody's written anything. There was no literature to go and look at. So at that point, Maggie Zhao, we didn't know one another. She contacted me and said, I'm really interested in this as a topic. And she said, shall we just explore it together? So we were in no way experts in inverted commas at that time. And so we just decided to perhaps offer a couple of webinars, which would be more a facilitated conversation, because what did we know? And it's just snowballed from there. We were invited to talk at a variety of different events. And then we knew we were onto something, because coaches were saying, this is really important. Supervisors were saying, this is really important. And so we did some articles in magazines, and then one thing led to another, and somebody said, you should write a book on this.
Can I feel into something for a moment? What were those events? What were those publications? Because is this within corporate? Is this branching out because of your network outside? Was the relevance of loss already clear within organizational spaces, or how was it welcomed?
I think the webinars were the Association for Coaching asked us to do an initial one-off and then a series. And the Global Supervisors Network, run by Eve Turner, and we did a session for them as well. So, and then I think we did a few articles for Coaching Perspectives, which is the Association for Coaching.
Yeah, I read one of those.
And Coaching at Work. I think we did one for them as well, called When the Tears Dry. So I think what we were trying to say was that loss in its many forms, because that was the thing that we discovered, was that this is not just about death here. This is about there are the Grief Recovery Handbook that we reference quite a lot suggests that there are at least 40 different losses that we may encounter in our lives. So then when you start to look at that list, actually loss does turn up in coaching more often than you would think.
Yeah, could we name some of those? Because I would love to put a bit of a frame around it. I know you mentioned some definitions in your AC article, but I'd love to just kind of bring it to the table, because when people hear bereavement and grief, and also the definitions tend to point to loss of a loved one, and I guess when we hear loved one, we immediately think about the person that's very, very close to us. But could you just broaden up the framework for what we're talking about here?
mean, actually starting from the death of a loved one, pets are a classic example whereby, as we know, the British love their pets, and so that will probably turn up a lot in coaching. So that, that is a death. But actually, probably the number one loss that turns up in coaching is loss of job, because a lot of coaches, that's even their niche area. They do outplacement coaching, working with people who are going to be made redundant, and career transition. So loss of job is probably the biggest one.
So much attached to that. I mean,
and focus on the emotional aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to point out, like, there's so much attached to this. It's not just the loss of a job, but depending on the job, there's a loss of social connections, there's loss of friends, loss of purpose or meaning, loss of certainty or security. There's so much loss of identity, social status. I mean, there's a lot going on. There's so much more lost than, it's just a job. You might get a new one, every ending is a new beginning. But it hits different people differently depending on what that job actually meant or what that thing that you've lost meant to you.
The other thing about loss is that it tends to be cumulative. So sometimes if we perceive that somebody's overreacting, again in inverted commas, that they're overreacting to a particular loss, they may not actually be overreacting to that loss. It may be that the loss that they're experiencing at the moment is just a long series of perhaps unfinished emotional trauma from previous losses, and the loss of the job may just be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So sometimes it's worth doing a little bit of digging, like, where else have you felt loss before? It can sometimes open up a conversation that people have never talked about before.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned a number of others. What really struck me was, loss of a child, loss of an unborn baby. I mean, there were a couple of areas of loss where I'm like, ooh, that all just screams therapy, and I've had my own, I think it must have been around the same time that you considered writing this book, that I had a conversation. I saw something, I think it was on Facebook, where someone in a coaching group was saying, I coach mothers who recently lost a young child. And I was just, what? And then it turned out that this person, like, I gently challenged him, was curious about, what does this have to do with coaching? My initial gut response was that's got to be dangerous. I mean, unless the coach is very well trained, have a therapy background. I mean, people who lose a young child, I mean, for the vast majority, how can coaching even be possible? How can coaching actually not be in the way of them getting the work or the help, the support that they need right now? How could you look forward? How could you? I mean, this is so heavy. Loss of a job. Yeah, I can see many people are quite resilient, right, and quite resourced. And from the few words that you said about how you process the loss, a lot of people can move forward, but some loss just seems so heavy that I thought, like, oh my God. And then it turned out that she did like a 3-day or 1-week course. And now she's a bereavement coach. And I just thought, that's dangerous. I mean, it can be helpful, I guess, but most of the time, I don't think that's right. So I wrote about it, and then I had a good handful of coaches who work with loss reach out and say, hey, look, actually, and I had some amazing conversations with really ethically sound, caring professionals, who really offered support, sometimes alongside therapy and sometimes with people who are just quite resourced. So that's kind of my own personal story of where I was like, oh my God, but then I kind of evolved. At first I was like, no. And then I'm like, oh yeah, there's actually a good place for it.
Yeah, there is.
But I guess I came in with the loss of a young child, and you do write about it in the book. Are there some areas where it's just a categorical no, that's not what coaching is for, or can coaching always have a place in that journey?
I think it can always have a place. It's interesting that we all carry an unsaid hierarchy of loss. So loss of a child is automatically seen as worse than anything else. But again, that's a judgment, isn't it? It's subjective. And so what we talk about in the book is that sometimes, I think there was a case study where somebody had lost a child many years ago. And again, it's like, if it's historical, it might still be emotional, and sometimes people are triggered a long time afterwards.
Oh yeah.
It's a case of everybody is individual and everybody is different. And sometimes people want quite action-focused things from coaching. So it could well be that they are getting support elsewhere, they are getting counselling elsewhere, and therefore they want the coach to work with them on some of the practical things. So I've certainly worked with people where they've just said, I need to talk about how I'm going to sort out my parents' house now and sell my parents' house,
will, funeral,
the funeral, all that, those sorts of things, and having some sort of practical action focused. Or another client who I had who sadly lost, it was like the aunt and uncle, and then became the guardian of the children who were left. So there was something there about processing the grief of, I think it was either a sister or a brother, but then having to think about the practical aspects of how I'm now going to absorb 2 children into my family that I've been left with, which is quite a big thing. So yes, she was having support for that from a therapist, but at the same time she wanted that practical help as well, talking about some of the more action focused things. So I think it's back to that thing again, is not making an assumption about how people would feel based on what we would feel, certainly. But you're right, loss of a child can stir up a lot of feelings in most of us, and we talk about miscarriage quite a lot, because that's also something that goes under the radar.
Yeah,
it's a huge loss. The thousands and thousands of miscarriages every day, and women feeling like they can't talk about it. That could be a loss that's in the background, that's being re-triggered by other things. And the same with terminations, abortions. Again, that's a secret loss that a lot of women don't talk about. But again, that can bubble up. And one of our case studies talks about somebody, a coach, coaching a woman who lost a child, but them feeling the massive guilt of knowing that she terminated pregnancy many years ago, and how does she work with somebody and look this person when she's not bereaved about her loss, but she is being triggered by the material that's coming up with this particular coaching client. So complex.
Yeah, great. So that's I guess let's go there first. What are some of the signs that it shows up? Because very often it's very obvious, right? So I'm curious about the not so obvious signs that loss and grief seems to be at play here, especially given that, most of the time coaching clients would probably also have a stance that, well, my grief and my loss and, deep emotional feelings of this, that's not what coaching is for, might be their understanding. So I wonder how a coach can spot that there might be something at play with. And then maybe we can go to how we make decisions on whether to coach this person or not, or whether coaching is the right thing. But first of all, how does it show up?
Well, in an obvious way, you will get people who are in tears and are emotionally obviously upset. But you can also get more subtle signs, reduced concentration, poor sleep, almost the signs that we see outside of bereavement sometimes. So loss of job can also show up some of those signs and symptoms too for people. I'm a big fan of making sure that we do enough biographical inquiry with coaching clients, one of the things I've noticed as a supervisor is that some coaches don't do enough of that, as if they're not supposed to ask questions about a person outside of a corporate context, if they're an executive coach. And so they don't have the bigger picture of the person's life. And I think we're all familiar with the Lifelines activity that you can do with coaching clients. And I find that really...
For those who are not, could you just briefly outline what you might do and maybe some other questions you might ask in this early stage?
Yeah, I mean, the Lifelines exercise is it's in the book, but it's one that's used quite a lot in all sorts of different aspects. So inviting the client to draw on a piece of paper, a line on the piece of paper from naught, as in when they were born, to how old they are now. Above the line is happy events, below the line is more negative events, and plotting those above and below the line. So it could be, dropping out of university, goes below the line, above the line, getting married, below the line, divorce, all sorts of different things. And then you can see this, most people have got a big wave of things that have happened to them. And interrogating that as the life's journey and finding out what happened here, not just from a negative point of view, but sometimes that can help you to establish where resilience is with clients. So, how did you get out of that? What did you do? How did you take a risk there? What decisions did you make at that? That's really, really useful positivity with some clients who perhaps feel like life's turned into a bit of a disaster. You can see that some things that, they were able to make decisions themselves. So I think that's also useful. One of the things I like to talk to people about is particularly coaches, about attachment theory, and asking people to just tell me about their life with their parents, their guardians, sometimes just going back to grandparents. And if we are talking about bereavement and death, we can then talk about, so how was death talked about in your family? And again, we make massive assumptions about how people approach death in their families, and that people have the same approach that we do. And it's amazing actually how different that is. And sometimes there are cultural aspects to that as well. So again, that helps people to think about spotting patterns of things that might be showing up in the here and now from the there and then. It could be things that have been long been secrets, or there were losses in previous generations that may be coming through for this person at the moment. So I think it's just asking questions. They don't always have to tell you, of course, but couching it in terms of the bigger picture, and also self-care. I think self-care is a really good way of getting in with certain clients, particularly if you're working corporately, because I think most people know about health and well-being and building resilience and taking care of themselves. They don't always necessarily do much about it, but I think it's a good way in to talk personally, perhaps with an executive who thinks you shouldn't be talking about coaching space. But I think that's sometimes a really good way of getting in and being able to explore actually what else is going on for them.
How do you start that kind of conversation? How would you open those kind of doors?
Yeah, I think at the very start, particularly with coaching clients, I think it's different with supervisees, but with coaching clients, I have a pre-coaching questionnaire that I use anyway, which I'm sure a lot of coaches do, which is asking lots of different questions just to get the ball rolling on coaching, which might be what have been your your highlights in the last 3 years. What have been your disappointments? What things particularly stress you? And what sort of things do you tolerate? What things would you like to change? And so that tells you a lot about a person, because how they fill it in tells you a lot. But it also normalizes the conversation about, I think one of my questions on there, it says something like, so how are you doing on the essentials, e.g. sleep, nutrition, physical exercise? And nobody thinks that's weird to ask that question, because of this whole well-being agenda that we have. And it means then you can sort of bring that in and notice whether there's anything that's concerning, if there's any alcohol or drug issues. I think asking a health and well-being question as standard for clients is very important anyway, because how do you know they're fit for coaching? You could get into session 2 or 3 and suddenly something quite serious appears that you didn't know about at the beginning, which means perhaps actually they're not ready for coaching at this time, and they may need some other intervention. So I think by normalizing that conversation and helping people to stabilize some of those essentials, so for instance, if you've got somebody who's drinking 20 cups of coffee a day and it's not letting them sleep, then
lightning fast results.
Yeah, exactly. How are they going to make the changes perhaps they need to change in their life and their work if they're running on empty? So it's creating that space that says, we're not just going to focus on your corporate agenda here,
this is bigger.
Team. This is bigger. This is the bigger piece, and that's the transformational aspect that I think that coaches can bring, rather than just, right, we're focusing on these corporate goals and that's it. We're doing a disservice otherwise.
Yeah, and that's also that systemic lens coming in. I remember I invited Peter to do a demo at some point a couple of years ago, and he would always draw a map of stakeholders just to get a broader sense of who this person is in the various systems. So, the existential lens is also exploring who is this person in front of me, not just in relation to their work issue or challenge or desire. But who are they? And as an existentialist, I always want to get a sense for my client's relationship with endings. And death is just one type of ending.
Yes.
But I think it's so important because they show up everywhere. It doesn't have to be loss and bereavement, but, every time a round birthday, any birthday comes as a reminder of time.
Landmark birthdays. Yeah. And you'd be surprised how often coaches don't know the age of their clients. And I say, how old's your client? Oh, I think they're about, and I said, well, why have you not asked? Because, it's significant. If somebody's saying, oh, they're 40 or they're 60, they're in different life stages, and also what else is going around them. Do they have young families, or are they nearing the end of their careers? Are they juggling children and elderly parents? There's all those sorts of things come into the mix. So you're right, there's endings happening all the time because of those transitions. And thinking about endings in a corporate sense, another question that I think would be really useful for most coaches to ask, and I know that they don't, is who was in the job before you? And that can sometimes help to winkle out some perhaps some problem. Maybe the last manager left under a cloud. Sometimes the last manager died and you've got to step into their shoes. That can create some stickiness in the system that the coachee is not even seeing, and noticing, and that the organisation may have decided not to acknowledge what's happened before, when we're just moving on and we've got somebody new in there, without thinking that actually, it's not a good thing to keep something secret or quiet. of what's gone before. So there's that question, but also your coachee, what happened in previous jobs? That's another question that's not often asked, because you may have somebody who has a series of unfinished endings, maybe endings that haven't ended well. We have an example of that in the book, where there was somebody who was bullied in one job. The next one, he had very little management support. Then the one after that, he had a redundancy. And the coach is trying to work with him, and he doesn't want to talk about the past because he just wants to move on with his new venture. But she's feeling like, I feel like he's not learned any lessons that could actually serve him well.
Then history is going to repeat.
Exactly. It's a bit like marriages, isn't it? If we don't do any processing of why the marriage failed, then we can easily take that into our next relationship, because we just haven't learned any lessons. I think those are they're obvious questions, but you'd be amazed how often we don't think of asking them as coaches.
Just move on, carry on, next thing, get involved in it, because the processing, the reflecting, the integration piece, it can be really difficult. And also a lot of people feel like they don't have time for this right now. They need to find the next job. Then, they feel lonely, they jump into the next relationship. Whatever the next thing is that helps us to forget about this ending rather than to actually make time and process it. And just a question like, the last person in the job, what a, maybe not so subtle, but what a reminder about, well, you'll be the last person in this job for the next person in the job.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I think humans have this tendency to not want to be so aware that endings are a thing and that they're going to happen, and death being one of those. I mean, I had quite a morning, because I spent the morning with you, more or less, looking to some stuff, reading some things, listening to you. And then before the podcast started, I went into the kitchen. I'm so grateful that I get to work from home. My 15-month-old daughter was sitting in the kitchen, and with my back to her, I just went to the bathroom and kind of came back. But I had a real moment of like, well, Julie's lost her father. I just heard, Papa! And what a joy to hear your daughter be so attached. And I'm going to be that person that hopefully dies before she does. And, there's an awareness of that yes, I'm probably more aware of it than other people, because I spend so much time with it and thinking about it and, reading the philosophers and being aware of endings and how important they are and how significant. But so many clients of ours, they really don't want to think about it. And only when it hits them in the face can they no longer ignore it. I knew a person once that would avoid walking even next to a cemetery, because it would be a remander that, her mother would be dying at some point, and there's nothing she can do about it other than perhaps die first. But people don't want to think about it and want it to come into awareness. So I think if we ask questions that invite that sort of reflection, what a valuable thing, but also potentially a lot of resistance. So I'm wondering how, if at all, do you work with that resistance? Is that just if somebody doesn't want to go there, we don't make them? Or is this, it seems an important part of the work. So I wonder how you navigate resistance when you meet it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because death is still so taboo. People don't want to talk about it because they're frightened, they're fearful. And my start point is with coaches, because I think if coaches don't want to talk about it, then how are they going to talk about it with clients? And again, everybody's in a different place, and so I engineer a conversation about endings, as in just ending the coaching session. So it's almost like that's almost like a start point, and it could be for novice coaches. That's as much as they want to go, but it's still a helpful conversation for them to think about how they end. And you'd be surprised how many people don't do their endings properly, because maybe it was something that wasn't covered in the coaching training that they did, or there's something in them that doesn't like endings. So they'll try and keep the coaching work continuing and get into sort of a never-ending contract with some coaching clients. So for some coaches, that's about as far as it goes. That's about as comfortable they are. And I think as a supervisor, you work with that, and particularly if you're working with somebody over a long period of time, you can move the conversation. So I know I've had some, because I supervise coaches and supervisors, I've had more in-depth conversations with the more experienced coaches. And one of my supervisors in particular, we talked about it a lot because he was older, he was getting to the end of his career, he was having some ill health problems. So therefore, that did keep showing up in the supervision session. From a practical point of view, do you tell your clients about your illness? What do you say? Should they be prepared in case anything happens? Because there's well-known examples of coaches just suddenly dying, and they haven't put anything in place, and then there's clients phoning up their families, where's my coach, I've paid my money, so there are practical issues around that sometimes about thinking about your own death in practice, which is certainly what I did with him. But with other coaches, it's like, okay, we could talk about endings, but then if I get a sense that the coach is, of that, reflective nature, and they seem like they want to talk about, other endings, I will then talk about, how they've ended relationships. So that's the next level down, which is still safe. We're still not talking about death. But, how have you ended relationships previously? So I had a coach who seemed to want to end with a client, but then kept offering little, but if you want to contact me, or, you can phone me in 2 months if you want. And it was like, what is this thing about wanting to end, but continuing in such a way? And I said to him, tell me about other endings in other relationships. So what about romantic partners? How did they happen? And he said, oh, I just waited for girlfriends to dump me. I never finished with them. And it was like a massive insight, because it was like, is this a repeating pattern? I'm not going to be the dumper. I'm always going to be the dumpee.
Shows up in your coaching.
Yeah, there it is.
Like they all do.
in his coaching. So that was a fear of endings from relationships. And then again, you could take that further. You could talk about endings in general. You could start talking about death if you feel that you can introduce that, if the coach feels like they're in that place where they're happy to do that. And you could talk about how was death discussed in your family. What was the first funeral you went to? How did that, what was that experience like? And people find it so freeing to say, do you know what? I've never talked to anybody about this before. People don't talk about death. So as a coach, I'm going, yeah, come on, we're both coaches here. Let's create a movement where we destigmatize conversations about death. So then if the coach is more comfortable with it, then they're more likely to find coaching clients who they can also be sufficiently brave with, because it takes some courage. Yeah. Not shoehorning it into the conversation, but waiting for those moments when it looks like it's a good conversation to have.
Yeah. Or now I have to, because I'm in a hole and I need to see a therapist.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But a conversation about loss can easily go into a conversation about death quite easily. So it's not as if you're suddenly just going, okay, let's talk about death today. It can easily evolve when people are talking about their life story, particularly when they talk about, I lost my parents, a number of years ago, just as a general biographical question.
Yeah, and this is where I find the existential lens so helpful, because like people talk about endings all the time. And like you say, the move from talking about endings, I mean, death has significantly shaped our relationship with endings. So, that's an easy entry, because endings happen all the time. Every day ends, every meeting ends, every sandwich ends, and every weather state ends. So just by talking about the weather, I find it amazing how often I already hear somebody's relationship with endings and uncertainty and temporality just by how somebody shows up, and they think they're doing small talk, but it's rarely small talk. On that note, I wanted to ask you, because you have a section on lenses on death and bereavement.
Yes.
And I noticed there wasn't an existential lens in the book, and I wondered why, given that you do mention, I heard you speak about having a lot of books on there. You mentioned existential somewhere. I wonder why it wasn't there.
Yeah. I think it's because we felt like we weaved it as a thread throughout the book. Rather than having a just this is going to be the lens, we're going to look at it from a very pragmatic point of view, Yannick. We only had 90,000 words, and one of the things that we realised, because we were writing it just before the pandemic, through the pandemic, there was a lot of new research, books coming out about death all the time, and it was starting to there's this new piece that's come out about death. Oh, we should put that in there. Oh, there's this other piece. And it's almost like at some point we said, right, we've got to stop. And I think we say that right at the end, that we feel like we've just started the process. This is the first book we know of in the coaching world. And that we're happy to hand the baton on to somebody else. So I guess anybody listening out there, yourself included, who's interested in a more existential lens, then that would be great. What would be the logical extension from this? But it was one of those cases where we have to stop somewhere here, because there was just so much more we could have written.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So on a very practical note, when do you refer and how do you make these decisions? Because you've already established that there's a lot that coaching can offer and coaches can offer, and depending on where the client is. But how do you make decisions on when coaching is not the right approach here?
Yeah. And when we talk to a grief coach, you mentioned earlier people who do this, this is their niche area, and we asked her about this, and she said, really, if the grief seems complex, and again, that's a judgment call.
Isn't all grief complex?
Yeah. I know what you mean, and connected to trauma. So it's quite a hard one to give a coaches sometimes like a black and white answer, particularly around counselling, and unfortunately there isn't one. And so one of the things that we say is that you need to explore it first and find out what's happening, rather than panicking too soon, which is what we think happens, is that somebody arrives and they're in floods of tears and they mention, something's happened, somebody's died. A coach, particularly, if they're a novice coach, or it's not something they've handled before, they can easily close something down without actually just being, a listening point at that time. So we have a little saying called "Be a heart with ears."
A heart with ears.
Heart with ears, yeah, and listen. And it doesn't mean that you are, going down the therapy route or getting into unknown territory. You were just listening to find out, what is this? Is this something that would require more therapy?
Is there, sorry to jump in, but I think this is a really important one, right? Because, a bit of context is that I can see that that's really going to be helpful if we first be a heart with ears and listen and kind of assess where they are and what this means to them, and how resourced they are and what's going on there. But I can also see the other perspective in terms of, well, if we start listening, it might be really difficult to close the door, to refer, because once we start listening, all of this stuff comes out, and then way more, and we might be opening the floodgates into something, now it's really opened up. And I have some ethical concerns with opening something up that, I'm not qualified to really hold. I mean, personally, I can listen to a lot of really heavy emotions. But I know there's a lot of coaches who just don't really feel equipped to manage or navigate that much emotion coming out. So I'm thinking about a few people that I've met in the supervision room where I'm like, well, if they would start listening and the floodgates open, they wouldn't know what to do or how to start. And if then a client gets referred or shut down, or maybe they're not so skilled at the referral part, really making sure that they're okay, it could possibly do more harm than good. I wonder how you would respond to those kind of concerns.
Yeah, I think there's a natural, a natural barrier that you might come up against, because what I'm hearing there is that as a coach, you may start to listen, because otherwise, how do you know? How do you know even what the issue is? So, an example, I remember a coach bringing to me something about self-harm. And he was in such panic about it. And I said to him, okay, so who is this person? When's it been happening? And he couldn't answer any of the questions, because she'd only said the words self-harm, and he panicked so much that he closed it down immediately and just said, I don't think this is something I can talk about. And sort of abandoned the session, and then came running to me. And it's like, it might not have been anything. It could have been historical, it could have been from years ago. You don't know whether this is an issue for this person. So I think it's listening enough. I think that's the key. Listening enough to get a handle on, right, okay, is this something that scares me as a coach? Do I think actually this is out of my skill set? And I think the other thing to bear in mind is it doesn't have to be either or. It doesn't have to be counselling or coaching. It could still be coaching, but maybe not you. So it could be a coach who's much more experienced than you, or it could be a coach who has got a psychotherapy background and works in a very blended way. There are quite a lot of people out there. So I don't think it's always an either or. And also, you don't always need therapy for everything. We've got an example in the book where somebody had a lot of therapy years ago from a bereavement, which had been fine, had been really, really helpful, and she'd been okay for like 20 odd years. I think that was a child death. And then something had triggered her in the workplace, and she'd come to the session and she was upset. But she didn't necessarily want any more counselling. So you could easily go down that route of going, oh no, I'm not talking about this. She didn't want to go back to counselling, and what the coach did was had a conversation with her about, well, how did the counselling work? What sort of things, did you use from that? And it was almost like a memory jogger for the person that went, oh, actually, we did this, this, and this. And it was almost like, well, I need to go back and revisit some of those tools and techniques that my counsellor taught me at the time that I'd sort of forgotten about. So that was a brilliant role for the coach, rather than going packing them off to therapy again.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense, because that person was resourced, because back then she found the resources. It's just something got triggered. But it reminds me of the work with trauma. Moving forward despite the trauma, but with people who've got the resources in them, and helping them to navigate that, rather than going into the complex relationships of the trauma or of the grief. Because once you feel out of your depth, then I think it's important that you're not the one doing the work.
Yes. I mean,
so I wonder if there's...
This is where supervision is important, of course. And obviously I would say that as a supervisor, but just knowing you've got your supervisor there, if things like this happen and you think, I think I'm not sure what to do, or I think I'm out of my depth, then, tap into your supervisor, because then what a great opportunity that is to learn something about, how you navigate these things. Ask these questions that you're asking of me, because they will be confronted by it again at some point. And these are, we learn best by actually experiencing things. So rather than always closing everything down, yes, it is operating safely, so you do no harm to your client, but at the same time, it's helping the coach navigate something. And sometimes I had a coach who came and she had what I would call anticipatory grief. The father had been given a terminal diagnosis, so she was really, really upset about that. Now, that isn't a case of like, oh, right, okay, that isn't coaching or supervision, let's pack you off to therapy. But, there was some conversations around a relationship with the father, but really she wanted practical advice from me that said, I'm not sure I can work with my clients over the next few days because I just feel so wobbly. What do I do? Do I phone them? Do I tell them what's happened? What about next week? Shall I cancel my sessions for next week? So it was part of a bigger practical discussion, which any coach or supervisor could help with, rather than going, oh, this person is desperately upset and is already grieving, her father's illness. Not everything requires therapy. Obviously, later on, things might emerge. And when he eventually dies, that may be something that she would want to pursue, because as a coach, sometimes counselling is a great personal development thing to do.
And did you put any contracting in place, or recommend to put any contracting in place? I'm thinking especially about that scenario where someone comes in, maybe you are 3-4 sessions into the engagement, and all of a sudden clearly something had happened and they're really upset. Because I had a couple of situations where someone came in like that, and I said, well, more or less saying, let's listen to it, let's explore it a bit, and if it feels like a different kind of support would be much more helpful to you, then we'll discuss it. Would that be okay? And then I had one of those actually say, you know what, I think I'd rather talk to someone else, and that was okay. And somebody else said, okay, but it felt important that there was something in there, that not all of a sudden I decide that I'm no longer listening, or that maybe they should go to speak to someone else.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think coaches sometimes are worried about how much they help a client access support. And we do speak to that in the book, because it's quite difficult to go and find a therapist, let's face it. So if that's something you decided, doing a Google search can be very overwhelming. So I think as a coach, perhaps having some names, or counselling websites or whatever is helpful. These are adults, and encouraging people to take those actions, also, but with an eye on duty of care. But I think you're right, recontracting is really important, because it depends what your original contract is, of course. So they may not want to talk to you about this particular loss, because they see you very much as being paid by the organisation. It feels a different contract for them, and they would prefer to take that bit offline somewhere else, to a therapist. But we also know that a lot of people are coming to coaching instead of counselling, because there's less stigma attached.
Therapy through the back door, as I often call it.
Exactly. So I think not only bereavement, a lot of coaches listening to this will be nodding their head when I say we are getting a lot more mental health issues in coaching than we ever did before. And so therefore we have to be more attuned to where is this line, and where's that line between just helping somebody with their self-care to get on an even keel, versus somebody who's got perhaps some more deep-seated issues that go back an awful long way, that would preclude them from having coaching. one of the things that I know the AC is working on at the moment, I know that the ICF, I think, have already got something on this, is about whether you can do coaching and counselling at the same time. And you can, but it's finding out whether what the therapist would say about that. So one of the things that we're developing for the AC policy is to empower our clients to go away, find a therapist, have a conversation with the therapist, and then almost the therapist decides, well, possibly pause the coaching at this time and let's get some counselling under our belt, and then your client may come back. Or the therapist might say, I can't see that there's any problem you having coaching at the same time as you're having counselling. So I know we need to clarify that more in the profession so that coaches are much clearer on where they stand in that position. But of course, at the end of the day, sometimes your clients, don't go and do what they say that they're going to do, and there's only so much that you can do unless you feel they're at risk of harm to self or others, which you can then escalate. But more often than not, you have to trust that they will go and find this other support that you've discussed between you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, I know a lot of therapists are very cautious about, are you also working with a life coach? Sometimes lots of misconceptions, sometimes very real concerns. And I think one of those real concerns that you address in your AC article as well is, well, therapists, they work on themselves for years, right? Many coaches do too. Yeah. But in therapy, it's a given that they went through their own personal therapy. And that's not a solution for all the things. There's a lot of therapists who really have made surprisingly little sense of who they are as a person and what triggers them. I'm flabbergasted at some of the stories I hear. But generally, there is a good effort that works a lot of the time, that therapists really have explored. What is my story? What is my relationship with grief and loss and endings? And when they are working with a client, they know when they're being triggered. So they're much less likely to be influenced by their own story and to put their own story and project it onto the client, or come in to rescue and help based on their own experience. And I see a lot of coaches with fantastic intentions, beautiful people, but not having gone through that kind of process, so that they're not equipped to stop the unconscious bias and the unconscious wanting to rescue and the, all of these dynamics that come up. That's the reason why therapists train for 4 to 10 years before they work with, deep grief. So you read here, and there's a quote that there aren't any recipes to mitigate these potential issues. And I was reading, then I thought, well, wait a second. Yes, they are. It's what therapists do. They go through years and years of placement and supervision and their own therapy. And then you're much more aware of, what's going on for you and how you're being triggered and how you're showing up. So you can work with that better. So I wonder if I must have misunderstood, because you clearly understand this very well. But what did you mean when you said, well, there aren't really any recipes there that we can mitigate that? I figured, well, I think they are. It's just a lot of coaches don't want to put the work in.
I agree. And when I talk to particularly new supervisees, when I'm contracting with them, I talk about continuing CPD, and they always interpret it as continuing professional development. And then I say to them, what about continuing personal development? And then part of the health and wellbeing question that I ask the standard is, have you ever had any counselling? And people go, oh, no. And it's interesting that even coaches answer that in a way as if to go, oh, no, I've never had any problems, so I don't. And I would say to them, actually, having some counselling will make you a better coach.
Oh, yeah.
Who you are is how you coach. And who are you? So that speaks to the fact that counsellors have done a lot of that asking questions. Who am I in this? I think coaches, once you get past maybe 5, 6, 7 years, it's less about another tool, another technique, the latest thing that's happening in coaching. It's more about you as the person. who are you that shows up in the coaching room, and that relational aspect of coaching. We're two human beings here, with our existential angst, sitting on this planet that also has existential angst. How do we work in partnership together? And so I encourage most of my supervisees to go and have some counselling they've never had, even if just for the practical purposes of, if you've experienced counselling yourself, how much easier is it for you to work out where the line is on referral? Because then you have a real lived experience of what a counsellor does and what it felt like for you. And I think that demystifies it. And also it helps to know where that line is for you as a coach, as well as you learn lots. The other thing I would say, same as coaches, we have some excellent coaches and maybe some not so excellent coaches. And I think that same goes for counsellors. I've had 3 lots of counselling in the last 20 years for different transitions in my life. And, one was okay, one was exceptional, one was all right, did the job at the time. And those are 3 different experiences. And they've probably all done their training, but it's about fit, it's about perhaps the school of learning that they use. I say to people, don't be put off if you've had counselling and you thought, oh, well, I had counselling, it really wasn't very good. Because sometimes you hear clients say that. And it just perhaps so happens that, the counsellor wasn't great, or the counsellor wasn't right for them at that time. So it's encouraging people to perhaps go back and find something else. But certainly coaches, that's a brilliant learning opportunity. Why wouldn't you want to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so many other avenues we could go in. Having an eye on the time, I wonder if there's something really important that we didn't talk about that would be really helpful for coaches out there to know or to consider. Anything you would want to offer for anybody who either recognizes that death, endings, grief, loss plays a role in their coaching, maybe currently faced with it, or somebody who would want to develop more into that area?
Yeah. I mean, gosh, that's a difficult question. I would say to coaches out there, explore your own grief and loss story. And it's not just about death. Really look at where the losses have been in your life. And the more you know about that, the more you are not going to be hijacked in a coaching session when loss will inevitably crop up. And that may be around counselling, or it may be about doing more reading. One of the ironies for me was that even though I got into this by accident, once me and Maggie started to work together, I realised I'd been doing the research on death and dying for years and years and years, from my late 30s, when I had that brush with existential fear that some of us get. And I started to read every book I could get my hands on about death to try and find some answer. And well, there you go. 20 years later, I was able to sort of take some of those books off my bookshelf and start to use them, as part of this process. So, that expertise doesn't come overnight. So I would say to people, follow where your interest is. Grief and loss is useful, and as we say, helping people to have conversations that they don't have anywhere else is a fantastic gift for most coaches.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. Julia, thank you so much for your time. How can people get in your sphere if people wanted to learn more? Obviously, the book you've written, other books you've written, anywhere else that you would send interested coaches who wanted to learn more from you or with you?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm on LinkedIn. My name is Julia Menaul, Menaul. So there's only me. So you'll find me very easily that way, or even just Google my name. There's only me. And my website is sparkcoachingandtraining.co.uk. So there's all the information on there. And obviously the book is published by Routledge. So if anybody wants to get a book directly from the Routledge publishers, then that's on there as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, please continue this work. It is so important. I think I'm maybe a bit biased, but I do very much believe in what you're doing. And I think it was very important that you started that conversation within coaching in a proper format. So really, thank you so much for your work. Keep on doing it. And I'm sure we see each other around because we operate in similar spaces.
Yes, I'm sure we will. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it, Yannick.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. To watch these episodes on video, make sure you also check out youtube.com/animascoaching. See you back here soon.